I love a bright headlamp for running on technical trails at night, but I also need something that can last for an entire night or sometimes more for some of the more demanding challenges that I tend to take on. And so I've been testing a series of high-powered headlamps in the quest to find the best for this particular use case. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to the brightest headlamp I've tested so far with a maximum output of 2000 lumens, the Nitecore HC68, which retails for $100 US. But that comes with some major caveats that I'll talk about in this review as I answer the question, is this headlamp suitable for trail runners? Now this video is quite detailed, but it's divided into chapters listed in the description, so feel free to skip ahead. I'm going to start by giving you an overview of all of its features and specifications. I'll then rate it based on a series of criteria, including comfort and fit, build quality, customization versus ease of use, and overall value compared to other headlamps in this price range. And lastly, I'll give you my final thoughts and suggested use cases for this headlamp. Now, Nitecore did send me this for review, but I was not paid to do so, and they have not seen, nor do they have any input into what I'll be saying in this video. I do, however, make a small commission from the affiliate links below, so in case you decide to buy the headlamp, I'd appreciate if you use those, and it won't cost you anything extra, but it does help out the channel. So let's start with what's in the box. The headlamp comes with a USB-C charging cable, a spare O-ring, the instructions, and a 3500 milliamp hour 18650 lithium-ion rechargeable battery. This is a pretty standard battery type for this class of headlamp. It's the same as the Fenix HM65RT, another high-powered headlamp that I've been testing for the past year or so. And the first four numbers of the battery tell you that it's 18 millimeters in diameter and 65 millimeters long. But it also works with a pair of CR123 batteries, which are the same diameter, but half the length. And those are much cheaper, but I believe are also quite a bit lower in capacity, and they won't work with the higher or turbo modes on this headlamp, which we'll talk about. But they could make for good backups to carry with you in a pinch. Now the headlamp weighs 167 grams with the battery and the strap, which also makes it the heaviest headlamp that I've personally ever used. Compare this again to the Fenix HM65RT, which comes in at just 140 grams. You can see though that this headlamp comes with an optional top strap, which adds a little bit to the weight and which is actually removable. Although this feature I find really does help to compensate for the weight, which I'll talk more about later on. It uses two luminous SST 40-watt LEDs, which happens again to be the exact same bulb used for the spotlight in the Fenix HM65RT. The difference is that it uses this bulb for both the spot and the flood, which when combined will give you that maximum output of 2000 lumens of white light. But there's a huge caveat here with these turbo modes. This will only last up to 60 seconds and possibly less if the heat protection mechanism kicks in early. These turbo modes are really designed for when you just need an extra boost of power or distance momentarily, say in a search and rescue situation. To Nitecore's credit though, this headlamp isn't actually specifically marketed for trail runners, and there's a reason why you don't often see these turbo modes on headlamps which are. It's just not something that a trail runner would ever need. I wish though that these brands wouldn't use these turbo ratings as the headline in their marketing because it can just be a little bit misleading. It then has a mode which is capable of delivering up to 1800 lumens for up to 30 minutes, what it calls the higher spotlight mode. Again here, as a trail runner, 30 minutes isn't going to get me very far, so I'd recommend that we set aside this mode completely as well. But if you are looking for a headlamp to also use for caving or search and rescue, then these higher power modes should definitely catch your attention. So with that in mind, let's move on to what it can sustain for a reasonable amount of time, which is 950 lumens on high spotlight mode. Now this, it can sustain for up to 2 hours and 30 minutes of runtime, which is more than enough to make easy runs in the evening feel like daylight. I should also point out here though that you're going to want to always take these output ratings with a grain of salt. And that's because most headlamps tend to start at their rated output level for a given mode, but will slowly start to dim as heat builds up and as the battery voltage drops. And this is why there's never a direct correlation between output and runtime. So for example, you'd expect that this high mode at 950 lumens would last about double as long as the higher mode at 1800 lumens, right? But as you can see here, it actually lasts 5 times as long. And I'm willing to bet that this all comes down to thermal regulation. And again, in both cases, you shouldn't expect that full 1800 or even 950 lumens for the entire stated runtime in real-world use. And I'll talk more about these kinds of effects in a future video. But where these high-powered headlamps really excite me is in how long they can last at a more reasonable output level. On medium spotlight mode, this headlamp will deliver up to 250 lumens for up to 6 hours. The floodlight ratings are very similar in terms of runtime, which is no surprise given that it uses the same bulb, just with a different reflector and lens, resulting in that different beam pattern. What's great though is how you can control these two LEDs separately to get a combination of spot and flood. So for example, you could use the spot mode on medium at 250 lumens, combined with the floodlight at around medium intensity for an additional 200 lumens or so of peripheral light. So you'd be getting 450 lumens of total output with a combination of these two beam patterns. Although your runtimes will vary, so you'd have to do a little bit of math. I'll explain how to do all of this later when I talk about customization versus ease of use. Now, there's of course a low setting for both the spotlight and the floodlight of 50 and 45 lumens respectively that lasts up to 28 hours each, which, while these may not be very useful for running, they could be great for camping, at aid stations, and so on, along with an ultra-low setting of only 1 lumen that lasts up to 800 hours, which I guess you could use in a tent. But there's also a red light mode, which is what these additional LEDs are here in the middle, which will give you 11 lumens on high for up to 30 hours, which is a feature that's actually missing from most headlamps that are designed specifically for trail running. This also has a beacon mode, which blasts out 2000 lumens of white light, as well as an SOS pattern, which could be useful if you were to ever find yourself in an emergency situation. In terms of charging, you unscrew the cap at the end to reveal its USB-C fast charging port. I'm a huge fan of USB-C charging, but it should be noted that the USB-C cable it comes with is actually USB-C to USB-A, meaning that you'll be limited to USB-A speeds unless you have your own USB-C to USB-C cable and compatible USB-C charger. The headlamp is rated IP68, which means it will be protected from dust and dirt and is waterproof and submersible up to 2 meters. And it's rated for up to 2 meters of impact resistance. And those are excellent ratings. So that's it for the features and specs. Now let's get into my experience in using this headlamp over the past month or so. Now, fit and comfort are really important considerations for me when choosing a headlamp, given that, as I said, I'll likely to be wearing it for hours at a time. While this headlamp is definitely heavy, the strap is actually quite comfortable. And as I alluded to before, I find the optional overhead band actually does a great job in distributing this weight. Now, I've actually never used a headlamp with this strap design because headlamps designed specifically for trail running usually don't have the overhead headband. But for me, I'd say it's necessary for a headlamp over, say, 120 grams or so. I find, for example, that even with the Fenix HM65RT, which has a similar form factor, but which is actually 20 grams lighter, it still bounces around quite a bit and needs to be readjusted from time to time. But with this extra strap on the Nitecore HC68, it's never felt like it's slipping or bouncing at all. Having said that, the strap isn't very easy to adjust while you're actually wearing it, and I find you need to take it off to fiddle with it a bit once in a while. So I'm going to deduct a point here and give it a rating of 4 out of 5 for fit and comfort. Now, ease of use is another huge consideration for me. I tend to rotate through a few different headlamps depending on my use case. For example, whether I'm going for a shorter evening run or running throughout the entire night, or maybe just carrying it in case of emergency. And I'm often using a headlamp in the dark while on the move, so it has to be completely intuitive to use because I can't stand having to remember complicated button combinations. The Nitecore HC68 provides a lot in terms of how the beams can be combined, but there's also a lot to remember. There's a single button on the side to turn the headlamp on and off. And this headlamp has a memory, so whichever beam was used last will be what turns on when you press this button. You then use the plus and minus buttons here to increase or decrease brightness in steps. To switch between beam patterns, you then need to hold down the button for the bulb that's off, which will give you stepless adjustability of that bulb's brightness. Once that second bulb reaches the same level as the first, it will become the primary beam, And at any point, you can now press the plus or minus buttons to change the new primary bulb in steps from low to higher mode. So this is super customizable, but I just find way too complicated for me, at least, as a trail runner. I find it hard sometimes to tell which of the two beam patterns I'm using, and I keep finding myself having to take the headlamp off to verify. I'm also not a huge fan of stepless activation, even though it's actually marketed as a selling feature. But I'd just rather a simple and clear low, medium, and high mode. I could see accidentally having it set too high, which could then get me in trouble when my headlamp dies prematurely. The one redeeming feature here, though, is the headlamp's memory function. So you could probably take the time to set your headlamp before starting your run, and then trust that it will go back to the same setting when you turn it off and on. In reality, though, I'm often switching between modes and beam patterns while on the move. To activate the red light, you need to double tap the power button. You then use the plus button to go from low red to high, and then to beacon and SOS mode. I didn't love this functionality either, because it's really easy to forget that you're already on high red and to accidentally go on to beacon mode, which blasts you and anyone around you with 2,000 lumens of white light, completely ruining your night vision, which is probably why you were using the red light mode in the first place. You similarly activate turbo mode when the light is off by pressing and holding the power button, which, as I said before, only lasts for up to 60 seconds, before both bulbs automatically return to their memorized state. Now, I'm glad that this is a separate function, because turbo mode not only burns battery very quickly, but it also causes the headlamp to get really hot. I activated this once by accident on a group run while we were standing at a trailhead, kind of waiting to regroup. And I went to cover my headlamp momentarily with my glove, as I often do, to avoid blinding some oncoming runners. And within just a few seconds, I burned a hole right through my glove and almost burned my skin. Headlamps like this are designed with heat sinks to help with thermoregulation, but it only goes so far. LED light doesn't produce much heat itself, but there's a lot of heat generated within the LED device, especially with these high-powered LEDs. The battery indicator also leaves a little to be desired. To activate it, you just need to press either the plus or minus button while it's turned off. It'll then flash blue depending on the remaining power. 4 times to show that it's at full power, 3 times to show that it's above 50%, twice that it's below 50, and once that it's below 10%. Now, sometimes when I see a single flash of blue, I think, okay, that must mean that it's charged. But then I have to remember that no, it needs to flash 3 or even 4 times on this particular headlamp for me to have enough battery to get through a run. I definitely prefer headlamps with multiple lights to indicate intuitively how much charge is left. There's also no lock on this headlamp, meaning that it could be accidentally activated in your pack, unless you remove the battery completely. Now, this is a pretty big drawback in my opinion when it comes to safety. And lastly, and this is a really small thing, there is no indication of which direction to insert the battery other than in the instruction manual. So again, here you have to remember which way you removed it when changing batteries, which I found a little bit annoying. So with all this in mind, I think I'd only give this headlamp 2 out of 5 for customization versus ease of use. Because while it's highly customizable and I love the memory function, it's just way too complicated for my needs as a trail runner. Having said that, the build quality of this headlamp is excellent. Nitecore has a great reputation, and they've been making award-winning headlamps for 15 years, so there's no surprises there. The optics are very good, and the lenses do a really great job of eliminating hot spots, particularly on the floodlight. I like that the charging port is so safely tucked away, and there's really no potential points of failure on this headlamp at all. It's built like a tank, and there's no reason it wouldn't last a lifetime, so I'd give it 5 out of 5 for build quality. Overall, at $100 US, and given all of its features, this headlamp is an excellent value compared to other headlamps in its class, and I give it an overall rating on value of 4 out of 5. Assume though that you're going to need a second battery, even just to carry as a backup, so that'll run you another 30 bucks or so. In terms of use cases though, I think this headlamp is pretty limited when it comes to trail running. As I said off the top, I'd love a bright headlamp, and even at the conservative rating of 950 lumens on high spotlight mode, this is definitely still overkill for trail running. And on medium mode, with 250 lumens for up to 6 hours, it's a lot of headlamp to carry for shorter evening runs. But that 6 hours also isn't really long enough to last through the night, so I don't think this would work for 100 milers either. With that in mind, I think it only really makes sense for a trail runner who also needs the functionality of an extremely bright beam for shorter periods of time, along with features like a red light. So again, things like camping, hunting, caving, search and rescue, or industrial applications, which is really what this headlamp was designed for. In fact, I'd say it's one of the best and definitely the most versatile headlamp that I've ever tried when it comes to these more general outdoor uses. But it's probably not the best fit for the average runner. I've got more headlamp reviews in the works as I continue my own search for the best headlamps for trail running, including one on the Fenix HM65 RT that I mentioned a couple of times, which I've been using for over a year now. So stay tuned for that. And let me know in the comments if you like the format for these reviews, or if there's anything else that you'd like to see. If you did find this video helpful, give it a like, and be sure to subscribe for more videos like this.